We have a question about impact on wildlife like turtles, beavers, frogs, birds, fishes other than trout. How did those streams change? I remember being on in Colfax when it was about a foot and a half deep sand flat above the dam, and there wasn't hardly a fish to be found there. So that's a dramatic change. Now it's a brook trout stream. But tell us a little bit more about uh, other species and is some of this beaver habitat?
Yeah, I mean, it's in an urban setting, so I mean, some of the wildlife is a more like an urban wildlife setting, but there's occasional otter in there now. They come on the Red Cedar River. It's connected to the Red Cedar. We also have a lot of stuff like waterfowl that kind of use that part through town, especially during seasonal migrations now. And then the fish community was probably the biggest thing that shifted there. I mean, we had pretty much a warm water fish community that's shifted to basically like a cool water fish community. And when we did our fish survey work, the IBI scores, which are kind of like your index of biotic integrity, tells you how healthy that system is, went from like a 20 beforehand on a scale of 100 and was 90 afterwards. So we definitely improved the fishery in that section of the river, and it's more um, um, comprehensive to what it was before the dam was there. But like in the case of Colfax, with it being such an urban setting, there's not a ton of wildlife there because it's, there's houses all around and stuff like that. But there's some access from the Red Cedar, so otter and stuff like that do frequent that section of the river now. So.
Mhm. Bob?
The Ward Pond was right in an urban area in the city of Merrill, but it became a real birding mecca. People started to really use that area for birding because there was such a wide variety of habitats. The fishery is much better because the dam was less than a mile from the Wisconsin River. Once the dam was taken out, we had a good overlap fishery. The warm water fish came up from the Wisconsin, cold water fish were in the prairie, and different times of different seasons, they would move back and forth. The smallmouth bass really colonized the upper river above the dam where all those boulder retards are. And then the brook trout from the Prairie River would come downstream to spend time in the winter for winter habitat because the river was larger, even going out into the Wisconsin River, and then coming back into the prairie for the following season. So we had fish moving back and forth. The warm and cold water fishes were overlapping in the river, whereas with the dam there, none of those fish could get to those habitats they needed seasonally. So I think it's a lot more stable fishery than we had before, in addition to a lot more variety.
I think they've found that in dam removals across the country, situations where dams have been impounding or interrupting fish habitat for many years. Perhaps that might be one species that is kind of the signature species in the East Coast. It might be Atlantic salmon, of which there are very few. But what they find when they take out the dam is that millions of shad run up those streams for the first time in 250 years. And so the whole assemblage of migratory fishes, and we're learning and learning and learning about those migratory fishes, get to exercise that migratory tendency where they haven't been able to do that in those for forever and ever. So that's
one wildlife incident we observed. People insisted on planting rye in the flats, the bud flats. So we did plant a little bit of rye because they wanted to do it. Well, what happened was when that rye grew up and the seeds were there were all kinds of mice out there. And there was all kinds of cover for the mice. So we saw raptors all over the place after those mice. There were quite a few snakes in there after the mice as well. But I think if we had just left it alone, the natural vegetation would have taken over and there would have been less of that. But people absolutely demanded that rye be planted in those flats. So we did it for them. But, it was an interesting raptor observation point.
Mm-hmm. Well, and when you talk about particular fish assemblages that are sort of based on the cold water assemblage, that's trout are sort of the apex species, but there are a lot of white suckers and sculpins and dace and other fish that are attuned to that cold water stuff. And when you start to get to cool water, that's smallmouth bass and walleyes and northerns and in Baraboo, Mike and Joe Burkle would tell you the number of species that they saw in the impoundments when there were dams consisted of suckers and red horse and a few minnow species that are attuned to cool water or warm water. And then the number of species that are now in there, now that it's a cool water flowing stream. It's not a trout stream, but it's a smallmouth bass stream. It's a walleye stream. It's a panfish stream. It's got a lot of different species in there. And all the minnow species that go with cool water systems. So it's much more diverse.
I can tell you also that
Mike?
we're actually getting some sturgeon coming in from the Wisconsin River. They're coming up into the gravel upstream. So, you know, it's, yeah, I mean, the change has been dramatic. I don't know what else to say. You know, we're seeing walleyes. We weren't catching walleyes before. You know, smallmouth bass, you get one occasionally. Now it's commonplace. And the amount of people that are actually fishing in the urban setting along the river, right across from my office, as a matter of fact, on a daily basis, I see fishermen out there just about every day, as long as the weather's decent.
Well, and as a sometime paddler, to be on a river that has sturgeon, sturgeon have a tendency to leap out of the water, and if you're paddling along and all of a sudden a 5-foot or 6-foot sturgeon comes up just completely out of the water and whacks down not far from you, it's a startling experience, but it's pretty neat.
Almost sounds like a beaver tail.
It does.